Hi there, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Keith here. We're going to do another book read aloud. This time I'm going to read you a chapter book. So it's going to take a few different videos of the chapters to finish the book. So we're not going to do it all in one day. This book is called Encyclopedia Brown, Boy Detective. And it's book number 1 in a series. I think it's a 4.0 or a 4.1 grade test or grade book. So it's right about at your level if you're reading at grade level. If you're reading at a higher grade level, it's okay. You can still take the AIR test on this book after you listen to all the chapters. I'm going to try to do 2 chapters a day, and there's 10 chapters, so that by Friday you can take an AIR test on this book. It is worth 1 point. It's a 1-point book. Okay, so we're going to start reading Encyclopedia Brown, Boy Detective. And if there's any pictures, I will show them to you, but there's not any pictures so far. Chapter 1, The Case of Natty Nat. Mr. and Mrs. Brown had one child. They called him Leroy, and so did his teachers. Everyone else in Idaville called him Encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book or a set of books giving information arranged alphabetically on all branches of knowledge. Leroy Brown's head was like an encyclopedia. It was filled with facts he had learned from books. He was like a complete library walking around in sneakers. Old ladies who did crossword puzzles were always stopping him on the street to ask him questions. Just last Sunday after church, Mrs. Conway, the butcher's wife, had asked him, "What is a 3-letter word for a Swiss river beginning with A?" "R," Encyclopedia answered after a moment. He always waited a moment. He wanted to be helpful, but he was afraid that people might not like him if he answered their questions too quickly and sounded too smart. His father asked him more questions than anyone else. Mr. Brown was the chief of police in Idaville. The town had 4 banks, 3 movie theaters, and a Little League. It had the usual number of gas stations, churches, schools, stores, and comfortable houses on shady streets. It even had a mansion or 2, and some dingy sections, and it had the average number of crimes for a community of its size. Idaville, however, only looked like the usual American town. It was really most unusual. For nearly a whole year, no criminal had escaped arrest, and no boy or girl had gotten away with breaking a single law in Idaville. This was partly because the town's policemen were clever and brave, but mostly it was because Chief Brown was Encyclopedia's father. His hardest cases were solved by Encyclopedia during dinner in the Browns' red brick house on Rover Avenue. Everyone in the state thought that Idaville had about the smartest policeman in the world. Of course, nobody knew a boy was the mastermind behind the town's police force. You wouldn't guess it by looking at Encyclopedia. He looked like almost any 5th grade boy and acted like one too, except that he never talked about himself. Mr. Brown never said a word about the advice his son gave him. Who would believe that his best detective was only 10 years old? This is how it began. One evening at dinner, Mr. Brown said, "Natty Nat has struck again. He has held up another store right here in Idaville." What store, Dad?" asked Encyclopedia. "The men's shop owned by Mr. Dillon and Mr. Jones," answered Mr. Brown. "That makes 6 stores Natty Nat has held up in the state this month." "Are you sure the robber was Natty Nat?" asked Encyclopedia. "Mr. Dillon himself said it was Natty Nat," replied Mr. Brown. He pulled a notebook from his pocket and put it beside his plate. "I wrote down everything Mr. Dillon told me about the holdup. I'll read it to you." Encyclopedia closed his eyes. He always closed his eyes when he was getting ready to think hard. His father began to read what Mr. Dillon, the storekeeper, had told him about the holdup. "I was in the store alone. I did not know anyone had come in. Suddenly, a man's voice told me to raise my hands. I looked up then. I was face to face with the man the newspapers call Natty Nat. He had on a gray coat with a belt in the back, just as the newspapers said. He told me to turn and face the wall. Since he had a gun, I did as he said. When I turned around again, he was gone with all the money. Chief Brown finished reading and closed his notebook. Encyclopedia asked only one question. Did the newspapers ever print a picture of Natty Nat? No, his father answered. He never stands still long enough for a picture to be taken. Remember, he's never been caught. But every policeman in the state knows he always wears that gray coat with a belt in the back. Nobody even knows his real name, said Encyclopedia, half to himself. Natty Nat is just what the papers call him. Suddenly he opened his eyes. Say, the only reason Mr. Dillon thought it was Natty Nat was because of the gray coat, he said. The case is solved. There's nothing to solve, objected Chief Brown. There's no mystery. Mr. Dillon was robbed. The hold-up man was the same one who's been robbing other stores in the state. Not quite, said Encyclopedia. There was no hold-up at the men's shop. What do you mean? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. I mean, Mr. Dillon wasn't robbed, Dad. He lied from the beginning, answered Encyclopedia. Why should Mr. Dillon lie? Demanded his father. I guess he spent the money. He didn't want his partner, Mr. Jones, to know that it was missing, said Encyclopedia, so Mr. Dillon said he was robbed. Leroy, said his mother, please explain what you are saying. It's simple, Mom, said Encyclopedia. Mr. Dillon read all about Natty Nat in the newspapers. So he knew Natty Nat always wore a gray coat with a belt in the back when he held up stores. Go on, Leroy, said Mrs. Brown, leaning forward. Mr. Dillon knew it would sound much better if he could blame his holdup on someone people have read about, said Encyclopedia. He said he knew it was Natty Nat because of the coat he wore. That could be true, Chief Brown said. That couldn't be true, said Encyclopedia. Mr. Dillon never saw the back of the man who held him up. He said so himself, remember? Chief Brown frowned. He picked up his notebook again. He read to himself a while. Then he fairly shouted, Leroy, I believe you are right. Encyclopedia said, Mr. Dillon only saw the front of the hold-up man. He had no way of knowing that the man's coat had a belt in the back. He stole money from his own store and from his partner, too, cried Chief Brown, and he nearly got away with it. He rushed from the dining room. Leroy, said Mrs. Brown, did you get this idea from a television program? No, said Encyclopedia. I got it from a book I read about a great detective and his methods of observation. Well, said his mother proudly, this proves how important it is to listen carefully and watch closely, to train your memory. Perhaps you will be a detective when you grow up. Mom, said Encyclopedia, can I have another piece of pie? Mrs. Brown sighed. She had taught English in the Idaville High School before her marriage. You may have another piece of pie, she said.